The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. The allure of eternal beauty. In the grand drawing room of a London townhouse, young Dorian Gray stood before the magnificent portrait that Basil Hallward had painted of him. The room was filled with the intoxicating scent of lilies and the soft murmur of a summer's breeze through the open windows. Dorian's eyes were fixed on the canvas, his mind racing with the words of Lord Henry Wotton, who lounged on a nearby chaise. "Beauty, Dorian, beauty is everything," Lord Henry said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "Youth and beauty are the only things worth having." Dorian turned to him, his expression a mix of wonder and fear. "But what happens when I grow old, when my beauty fades?" Lord Henry chuckled softly. "Why, you must never let it fade. You must capture it, keep it locked away if you must." Basil, who had been quietly observing from the corner, felt a pang of worry. "Henry, don't fill his head with such nonsense. Beauty is fleeting. It's the soul that endures." Dorian looked back at the portrait, his heart aching with a longing that was both thrilling and terrifying. He yearned not just for eternal youth, but for an existence where beauty and pleasure were eternal, where the ravages of time could not touch him. I wish it was the other way around, that the portrait would grow old and I would remain young and beautiful, like this, forever." No sooner had the words left his lips than a shiver ran through the room, a whisper of fate that seemed to echo his deepest desires. As days turned into weeks, Dorian began to notice something peculiar. Despite late nights and indulgent parties, his face remained as fresh as the day Basil had captured it on canvas. Yet, the portrait seemed different. It bore a new, almost imperceptible line each time he looked. A subtle hint of his inner transformation was already taking shape on the painted surface. One evening, after a particularly wild soirée, Dorian stumbled into the room where the portrait was kept. He gasped. The face on the canvas looked tired, with eyes that held a hint of sorrow. Dorian touched his own face. It was smooth, unmarked. "It can't be," he whispered to himself. "The wish, it came true?" From that moment on, Dorian embraced Lord Henry's philosophy with fervor. He sought pleasure without consequence, beauty without cost. And as he did, the portrait became a grotesque mirror of his soul, hidden away behind a velvet curtain, while Dorian Gray, the man, remained untouched by time or guilt. But whispers began to spread through London society. Whispers of a young man who never aged, of a beauty that seemed almost unnatural. And as the rumors grew, so did the darkness in Dorian's heart, a darkness reflected in the ever-changing portrait that bore the burden of his sins. The murmurs became a cacophony, a symphony of suspicion and awe that followed Dorian wherever he went, casting long shadows over his every step. Basil, meanwhile, wrestled with his own thoughts. In the quiet of his studio, he pondered the nature of beauty in the soul. "True beauty," he mused, "lies not in the eternal preservation of youth, but in the depth of one's character, the light of one's spirit." "I unwittingly unleashed a monster upon the world." His hands trembled as he considered the implications of Dorian's unchanged visage and the dark rumors that swirled around his once innocent muse. The enchantment of Sybil Vane. In the gaslit glow of the theater, Dorian Gray sat mesmerized. Each night, Dorian returned, drawn to the spectacle of Sybil Vane transforming into Shakespeare's Juliet, Marlowe's Helen, each character more vivid than the last. One evening, after the curtain fell, Dorian made his way backstage. He found Sybil alone, her face still flushed from the performance. "Sybil," he began, "your talent is the light in this dreary world. You've captured my heart." Sybil turned to him, her eyes wide. "Oh, Dorian, do you truly mean that? Your words, they're like a sonnet." Dorian took her hands. "Every word. You are not just an actress to me. You are the heroines you portray, so full of life and spirit." Their conversation was cut short by the arrival of Sybil's mother. "Mr. Gray, a pleasure. I trust you find my daughter's performances to your liking?" "More than that, Mrs. Vane," Dorian replied. "They are a revelation." But the enchantment was not to last. Lord Henry's words echoed in Dorian's mind, a constant reminder that beauty and pleasure were all that mattered. When Sybil's performances began to falter, the spell was broken. Dorian's affection turned to disdain. "Why do you torment me so, Dorian?" Sybil cried one fateful night. "I gave you my heart, and now you scorn me." "It's not you, Sybil," Dorian retorted coldly. "It's your art. You were divine. Now you are ordinary." Sybil's heart shattered. The magic of the theater, the joy of her performances, all had been for Dorian. And without his love, they meant nothing. Dorian's enchantment with Sybil Vane was no more, and the portrait that bore the weight of his sins grew ever more grotesque. The portrait's burden. In the dimly lit room, the heavy curtains drawn tight, Dorian Gray stood before his portrait, the only witness to his secret life. The once pristine canvas now bore the grotesque image of a man corrupted by sin and excess, a stark contrast to the beautiful youth that stared back at him from the mirror. The portrait remained silent, its twisted smile a mockery of Dorian's despair. In the streets of London, whispers about Dorian's unchanging beauty grew louder, and the rumors of his scandalous behavior became the talk of every drawing room. Yet no one could deny the charm he exuded, the allure that drew both men and women to him like moths to a flame. At one of his extravagant gatherings, two guests in hushed conversation caught his attention. "It's unnatural how he remains untouched by time," said a lady, her eyes following Dorian's every move. "Indeed," replied her companion, a gentleman with a skeptical frown. "One wonders if he's made a pact with darker forces." In the solitude of his home, Dorian faced his portrait. The portrait seemed to sneer at him, its eyes following his every move. As days turned into weeks, Dorian's life spiraled further into debauchery. Each vile act left its mark on the portrait, and with each passing moment, the burden of his secret grew heavier. Dorian locked away his portrait, the burden of his sins hidden from the world, but ever present in the shadows of his mind. As he gazed upon his reflection, untouched by time, he was left to ponder the nature of his existence. A society scandal. In the heart of London, the enigmatic Dorian Gray continued to navigate the complexities of high society. His life, shrouded in secrecy and whispers of scandal, remained a source of intrigue. The talented Basil Hallward's absence was noted, but Dorian deflected inquiries with vague mentions of the artist's dedication to his craft. At the lavish gatherings, Dorian's charm and grace were undiminished, yet an undercurrent of unease ran through the crowds. Conversations were carefully steered away from the sensitive topic of his perpetual youth, focusing instead on the more immediate delights and dramas of the London elite. As the night progressed, the revelry masked the darker underbelly of Dorian's world. The true extent of his influence and the nature of his existence remained hidden, much like the portrait that bore the weight of his hidden truths, a stark contrast to the flawless facade he presented to the world. The web of deceit. In the dimly lit room, Dorian Gray stood before Alan Campbell, his face etched with urgency. The silence was palpable, broken only by the distant hum of London's nightlife. "Dorian, what brings you here at this hour?" Alan's voice was calm, yet a hint of concern flickered in his eyes. "You must help me, Alan," Dorian implored, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's urgent." Alan's expression turned grave. "I am a scientist, Dorian, not a fixer of dire situations. "It's Basil." Dorian's voice wavered. "He's no longer with us." Alan's complexion turned ashen. "Basil? How?" Dorian averted his gaze. "An unfortunate event," he lied. "But if they find him here, I'm finished." Alan stood motionless, the weight of the moment bearing down on him. "What do you propose?" "Your expertise," Dorian murmured, the words heavy with implication. Alan's resolve wavered. "This is folly, Dorian." Dorian stepped forward, his tone laced with a threat. "You owe me for past discretions. The letters I safeguarded for you?" Alan's color faded further. "You wouldn't dare." "I must protect myself," Dorian stated icily. "And you will assist me." The room was engulfed in silence as Alan grappled with his principles. At last he nodded, a gesture of reluctant agreement. "What must be done?" A cold semblance of a smile touched Dorian's lips. "Thank you, Alan. I knew I could rely on you." As Alan commenced his grim task, the concoction of chemicals hissing and churning, Dorian lingered in the shadows, his spirit untouched by remorse. The deceitful web had been woven, and Alan Campbell, once a beacon of science and virtue, was now ensnared. The hidden portrait stood as a silent observer to the decay of Dorian Gray's soul, its canvas a grim record of the cost of unyielding youth and allure. And in the depths of London, shrouded in secrecy, the web of treachery expanded, capturing all who ventured too near. The haunting of James Vane. The night was thick with fog, the kind that swallows up the streets of London and muffles the sounds of the city. In the dim light of a lone gas lamp, a figure emerged, his steps heavy with purpose. James Vane's eyes were fixed on a grand house that stood apart from the others, its windows dark as if hiding secrets. Inside, Dorian Gray lounged in an opulent room surrounded by the trappings of wealth, but his mind was a tempest of guilt and fear. The doorbell's chime shattered the silence, and with a sense of foreboding, Dorian answered the door to find James Vane, his face etched with grief and anger. "You!" James's voice was a low growl. "You're the one who destroyed my sister's life." Dorian stepped back, feigning confusion. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, sir. I don't know your sister." "Lies." James's hand trembled as he pointed at Dorian. "Sybil spoke of you, her Prince Charming, before she took her own life because of your cruelty." As Dorian's heart raced, he felt the weight of his sins. He thought of Sybil, the innocent soul he had crushed under his selfish desires, and her family, now shattered by loss. "Look at me," he urged, stepping into the light. "Do I look like a man who could have known your sister years ago?" A woman's voice cut through the tension. "He's the one, James. That devil hasn't aged a day since he ruined me 18 years ago." It was Mrs. Vane, Sybil's mother, her face a map of the hardships she'd endured, her eyes a mirror of the same grief that haunted James. James turned to Mrs. Vane, then back to Dorian, his suspicion reignited. "What sorcery is this?" Sightseeing the moment of confusion, Dorian slipped away, leaving James to grapple with the truth that had been revealed. As he retreated to the shadows of his home, Dorian's gaze fell upon the portrait that bore the marks of his corruption. For a fleeting moment he pondered the twisted path his life had taken, all due to the dark pact reflected in the painting's visage. After James and Mrs. Vane vanished into the night, the fog lifted, revealing the city once more. Dorian stood alone, the silence of the house echoing the emptiness within him. The illusion of redemption. Dorian Gray, the man who once reveled in the eternal youth granted by his mystical portrait, now faced the stark reality of his actions. The portrait, a grotesque reflection of his inner self, was a constant reminder of the lives he had shattered. Memories of Sybil Vane and Basil Hallward haunted him, each recollection a sharp pang of guilt. In the quiet of his room, away from the influence of Lord Henry's hedonistic philosophies, Dorian grappled with the weight of his conscience. The laughter and joy of the outside world, exemplified by the innocent Hetty, seemed a distant dream to him. As the night deepened, Dorian wrestled with his thoughts. The path to redemption was unclear, shrouded in the complexity of his past deeds. Yet, in the solitude of his chamber, a faint glimmer of hope emerged, a hope to find a semblance of peace, to somehow right the wrongs of a life misspent. The journey ahead was uncertain, but the first steps of change had been taken, quietly, within the confines of his own heart. The final act. In the dimly lit room, Dorian Gray stood before his portrait, the only witness to the years of his secret decadence. The once beautiful image now twisted into a grotesque caricature of his inner self, each sin etched into the paint like a scar, a stark contrast to the young man's outwardly pristine appearance. "Why do you mock me?" Dorian whispered to the portrait, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and despair. "You are the chain that binds me to this cursed existence." The portrait, silent as ever, continued to stare back with hollow eyes, a mirror to Dorian's tormented soul. It was in this moment that Dorian's thoughts turned to Sybil Vane, the innocent girl whose heart he had callously broken, leading to her untimely death. Her memory, once a fleeting regret, now screamed in his mind, a relentless echo of his cruelty. "I wanted to escape the ugliness within, but it's you who have made it visible to the world," he continued, his hands clenching into fists. "It was your beauty that I cherished, and now it's your ugliness that I loathe." The room seemed to close in on him, the walls whispering the names of those he had wronged. In a fit of rage, Dorian seized a knife and turned it towards the portrait. "This ends now," he declared, the blade glinting in the candlelight. With a swift motion, Dorian plunged the knife into the canvas. A sharp cry pierced the silence, a sound so harrowing that it seemed to come from the depths of his own soul. Dorian staggered backward, a sudden pain overtaking him. As he fell, his eyes caught a glimpse of the portrait, and as darkness closed in, the last thing he saw was an image that would remain a mystery.